Yes? Okay, shall I start?
No. Well, what we are saying is the poster. You have to. No, I can see it. Well, if you want, I can. Yes, now. Yes, right now. No, now we can see it. No.
Can you
Okay.
see it?
Yes. Yes.
Can I start then?
Let me introduce you as the chair.
Okay, thank
Welcome everybody to the first session entitled Rewriting Through Translation. And our first speaker is Mirella Agorni, Università Ca' Foscari di Venezia. The role of women in translational history, translating and collaborating in the reshaping of Italy in the early Romantic period. And I'll be timing the session, Mirella, so I can give you a 1-minute warning and let you know if 15 minutes has passed. Thank you.
Okay, thanks a lot. And first of all, I would like to thank the organizers for inviting me to this very stimulating conference. And actually, my only regret is not to be able to be there with you, to see friends, to meet friends once again. And also, I think that the weather in Valencia must be spectacular at this time of the year, and it's not the same in the north of Italy. So I wish I could come and meet you once again very soon. So let's start with my paper now, and you can see the title, The Role of Women in Translation History, Translating and Collaborating in the Reshaping of Italy in the Early Romantic Period. I want to start by saying that translation plays a fundamental role at times of transition, but this role, and especially the role of translation on the development of new female modes of expressions, have very rarely been analyzed. And the main reason for this is the derivative nature of translation, because translation is very often considered as a secondary activity in comparison with original writing. So I will argue that the specificity of women's contribution to translation may prove to be a very productive source for historical analysis of cultural developments. In my volume on 18th century women writers and translators, I actually tried to trace, let's say, women's appropriation of the image of Italy for the development of a very specific tradition of British women's writing. My current research is taking now my analysis just a few decades later, so I'm getting to the early 19th century, in a sort of, how can we say, reversed perspective, because it takes into account the function of translation in shaping the renewal of Italian culture that laid at the basis of the formation of a unified Italian state. And again, the role played by women has hardly ever been paid attention to. So the introduction by women translators of the new genre of educational or children's literature into the Italian literary system via translation seems to be particularly significant. In 1816, Germaine de Stael published her essay on the spirit of translation, and this triggered a strong literary controversy between two factions. Sorry, I saw a message. I don't know where it was meant to me, hopefully not. So we can see that two approaches to translation faced each other. And on the one hand, we had an adaptive and domesticating translation strategy, which was supported by the classicists, and on the other, a source-oriented and we could say a culturally sensitive approach, which was promoted by the Romantics. The classicist domestication strategies were clearly aimed at readers who could read the source text in its original language. The Romantics wanted instead to find new elements to be introduced into the Italian cultural system. So they favored a so-called foreignizing approach because what they wanted to do was to retain some aspects of the original source text and introduce those aspects into the Italian literary system. Most romantic movements in Europe were favoring similar foreignizing approaches, but the Italian context was producing a new approach that combined fidelity to the source text with a concern for making the translation accessible to a new and wider readership. So, in contrast to the trends in the rest of Europe, the Italian Romantics were characterized by a continuity with the tradition of the Enlightenment. In this view, literature played an important social role and had to be appreciated by a reading public which was no longer limited to a highly educated elite. So the innovative impulse of the Italian Romantics led to significant changes in translation. Romantic translators wanted to offer their readers an image of the context of the source text in order to help them understand the linguistic and cultural diversity to which the very source text belonged. And one of the main consequences of all this was a new visibility of translators, because they started to express themselves, especially in prefaces and in footnotes. So translation produced a debate among a variety of cultural agents, not just translators, but also reviewers, literary critics, and even publishers. The novel was the most important literary genre to enter Italy via translation, but it was not the only one, because another genre, children's literature, was also introduced. In these years, the need for a specific literature dedicated to children began to be felt, and a certain interest in the education of young people. We have to say that it had already manifested itself in previous periods, especially in the form of instructive writing. But there was a lack of specific works, specific literature dedicated to children. And this lack was perceived by many cultural agents who discussed it in many periodicals. So translation was undertaken, and in particular, the works of one of the most successful writers in English language, Maria Edgeworth, were translated. We have to say that Edgeworth had already achieved considerable fame all over Europe. And Bianca Milesi Moyon, a translator who was very close to Italian Romantic circles and to the revolutionary ideals, she translated most of the educational works of Edgeworth. But who was Bianca Milesi? Bianca Milesi was born in 1790 into a rich merchant family, and in 1814 she opened her own literary salon in Milan, which became a favorite place for romantic circles and anti-Austria revolutionaries. Milesi was a member of the Società delle Giardiniere. It was the so-called gardener girls. It was a secret society which was made up by women from the upper classes who opposed the Austrian regime. In the early 1820s, the Austrians began a harsh repression in the Italian territories they occupied, and Milesi was arrested and then released. And she began to get involved in social work, supporting the Society for Mutual Education that Federico Confalonieri had founded. Because of constant Austrian control, she eventually moved abroad and she lived first in Geneva, where she met the economist Sismondi de Sismondi, who introduced her into the progressive circles where Edgeworth's educational ideas already circulated, and then she moved all over Europe. She came back to Italy in 1824 and moved to Genoa, where she met the medical doctor Benedetto Moyon. She married him and had 3 children. In Genoa, she opened another salon, which hosted revolutionary circles. In 1833, she decided to leave Italy forever and moved to Paris with a family. And in the following year, she and her husband died. They died of cholera just a few hours apart. Milesi's social activity was reflected in an intense activity of translation from the English, especially of Edgeworth's works. And here you have a list of her translation, but what we are going to focus on is her translation of Prime Lezioni. And Prime Lezioni was first published in 1829 and included only 4 short stories. In 1833 and 34, a second and revised edition came out in 4 volumes, and the number of short stories had increased considerably. Now, the history of publishing gives us evidence of the success of Milesi's translation, but not only in terms of published editions, but also and especially if we consider the reviews of these works in the main periodicals of the time. As early as August 1829, the pro-Austrian periodical La Biblioteca Italiana reviewed the first translation of Prime Lezioni and dedicated ample space to translation itself. A list of terms, for example, were judged to be too difficult or too refined for a volume which addressed children. And here you have a couple of examples. The expression gremiti di foglie, which means full of leaves, and the reviewer said that more simple verbs could have been used, such as ricoperti, sparsi di foglie, so covered, scattered with leaves, or the use of alliteratory terms such as fiammeggiare, which means to blaze, rather than the more colloquial ardere, which means simply to burn. Another review appeared in the same year, so in 1829, in the progressive periodical Antologia. And in spite of the positive reception of the translation, a few shortcomings were brought to the attention of the readers. And I'm going to read this quotation very quickly. If one examines her work in detail, one will perhaps observe that some periods could have been made even clearer, some sentences could have been changed into more proper ones, some definitions of the small glossary placed between the last lessons could have been left out or improved. And nevertheless, this work will seem to all to be most felicitous. So once again, I would say, as in the previous review, the criticism was based on the assumption of children's ability to understand. In 1834, the Biblioteca Italiana published a new review of the second edition of Prime Lezioni, and the reviewer referred to the positive reception of the first edition in 1829 and congratulated the translator because she had collaborated with the reviewers, as most of the suggestions had been taken on board. So I would say that on the whole, the reviews published in the main Italian periodicals, and we could also add a couple of minor ones, such as those published in the Eco and another one published in the Gazzetta Privilegiata di Milano, well, they are all evidence of the success of Milesi's translation. And surely the main reason for this success is a genre gap in the target cultural system, as it has been theorized by translation scholars such as Gideon Toury and especially Evan Zohar in his polysystemic approach. These scholars saw translation as the primary means for filling the gaps in the target cultural systems, gaps which manifest themselves in periods of transition when traditional forms begin to be perceived as obsolete. And these innovations can be formal in terms of new literary genres, or they may also concern content. But polysystemic theory helps us to understand not only what is translated, and I mean, which works, what kind of works are imported from abroad via translation, but also how they are translated. That is, which strategies are adopted, more or less faithful to the source text. So using Venuti's terms, these strategies can be defined as domesticating versus foreignizing. Now, as we have already anticipated, in the first decades of the 19th century, a romantic foreignizing approach to translation had already emerged. But we should keep in mind that in those very years, the Italian Romantics were producing an innovative approach that combined a strong fidelity to the source text with a concern for making the translation accessible to a new and expanding Italian readership. Now, having made all these considerations, we could ask, how far can Milesi's translation of Prime Lezioni be placed on a continuum from domesticating to foreignizing strategies? Well, I'm going to try to answer these questions by quoting an essay which was published in 2014 by Fernandez Rodriguez, who has argued that Milesi's version of Prime Lezioni, and particularly of the short story Benedetto, has to be considered an adaptation rather than a translation. And she also based her argument on the theoretical assumptions of polysystem theory. Now, in order to support her hypothesis, Fernandez Rodriguez cites the review of the second edition of Prime Lezioni, which was published in another Italian periodical, L'Indicatore, in 1835. And here, the reviewer warned readers that they would not find a word for word, sentence for sentence translation, but rather he said that the translator had acted to mediate all those cases in which the two cultural systems, and I mean the Italian and the English ones, diverged. Fernandez Rodriguez goes into the details of most of the translator's interventions and claims that the consequence of this strategy was to deprive the target reader of cultural information which deserved special attention. And I'm going to come back to this point later. Now, the most important mark of Milesi's translation was obviously adaptation to Italian culture. For example, Milesi changed all proper names and replaced them with Italian ones. So the main character, Frank, becomes in Italian Benedetto. Also, units of measure were also adapted and miles became miglia. There were historical adaptations. For example, Cromwell and the English civil wars were rendered as the Italian independence wars. And also all the geographical, historical, and cultural references to England were replaced by those to the region of Lombardy, where the city of Milan is located. And also, finally, the translator also included additional information, and in some cases, she even added some patriotic overtones. And I want to quote this example. Now, I'm going to read first the original by Edgeworth, and then a translation of Millesi's translation. So this is the conversation next turn upon one of those old towers, which are called Caesar Towers, and various facts of history were mentioned. And this is the translation of Millesi's translation. The conversation turned to the scarcity of Roman monuments in Lombardy, although Milan has long been the seat of emperors. Blame for the almost total destruction was placed on the fact that this plain was the first place where the blind fury of the barbaric hordes who had progressively flooded Italy was vented. Now, Fernandez Rodriguez points out that the main characteristics of Edgeworth's pedagogical writing are a rather conventional style, which is full of learned references, and that these characteristics had been maintained in the translations into French and Spanish. According to this scholar, the Italian translation favored instead an adaptation strategy in a Berlin-Fidel approach, which, however, I would say was strongly opposed by the circle of Italian romantics to which Millesi herself belonged. So I think that the translator's complex cultural mediation has probably not been sufficiently paid attention to, and perhaps the voice of the translator herself could help us to find a more, how can we say, historically sensitive interpretation. The translator, or the translators, as she defined herself, her voice was clearly expressed in the second edition of Prime Lezioni, because Millesi opened this version with a very short preface in which she quoted part of the text of the first review of the Biblioteca Italiana, and then illustrates the method she used in her translation. And she admits that she did not always follow the original source text, but deviated from it, and I quote, "When I thought it appropriate to substitute descriptions of places or customs of England and quotations from English authors and books with others proper to the geography or customs of literature of Italy, in order to better serve the understanding of Italian children and to better assist their education." Moreover, the translator stated that she had decided not to mention her interventions in the footnotes in order not to cause, and I quote once again, obstacles to the reading comprehension of the child who would not be able to understand them. So Millesi was aware of the new approach to translation advocated by the Romantics, and yet she decided to adapt the text to the needs of the specific reader for whom the translation was intended, that is, Italian children. Indeed, her translation project can be defined as a linguistic as well as a political project, because she links her process of linguistic mediation to her desire to promote a sense of Italian national identity. And her intention is very clear in her own words, and I quote, "This Italian translation of Prime Lezioni will serve, I hope, to facilitate the understanding of domestic vocabulary and thus to increasingly strengthen those ties that bind every province of Italy to a common homeland." So Millesi's awareness of the purpose of her translation, and especially of the readership she was addressing, far from being reminiscent of the Berlin Fidel translation approach, seems to be extremely innovative. The purpose of her work was the education of Italian children, and so she had adapted the source text to the specific needs of a very well identified reader. And this reader was so well identified that they deserved a proper address in a paratextual section specifically dedicated to children. The second edition of Prime Lezioni introduced, in fact, a new section in which the translator spoke directly to her readers in a very simple and colloquial language, which was suitable for the comprehension of a young readership. And now I'm going to read a long quotation because I think this is particularly significant. My dear children, I don't think you know what a vocabulary is, so I will explain it to you. A vocabulary is the same as a dictionary, and there will be no one among you who has not seen a Latin or Italian dictionary. Here, on the other hand, there are no foreign names, they are all Italians, which perhaps you do not yet know, or which you have heard mentioned without really understanding their meaning. My vocabulary then is very small. It contains only a few explanations of words and things, such as Dad, Mom would give you if they were always there for you when you read. Here, the translator seems to enhance the intention of the original author, that is Edgeworth's pedagogical project, allowing the translated text to be read independently by the children. So the reader of the translation is specifically identified, and the language has been adapted to their needs and to the level of understanding. Now I'm getting to my conclusion by saying that Milesi's work of linguistic and cultural mediation was innovative and modern in an Italy which was not yet politically unified, but where a new romantic and foreignizing ideology on translation had already emerged. And this ideology had strong social implications and favored the introduction of a new genre of educational literature for children. The translation of this new genre was judged according to very modern criteria, because the priority was to maintain the pedagogical function of this genre, and this meant a complex linguistic and I would say also cultural adaptation, but which was not driven by aesthetic concerns, as in the tradition of the Bedel, but rather by the need to make the text accessible to a very specific readership, that is, children and Italian children. So to be faithful to the original did not imply a rigid observance of content or form, but rather, I would say, an accurate preservation of those characteristics that had made the original English text suitable for children and for the children to whom it was addressed, English children. And that is why the reviewer of the Biblioteca Italiana had suggested the terms that the Italian translator should have avoided in order not to run the risk of producing a translation too difficult to be read by children. And that especially is why the translator had collaborated and accepted those translations, and she went even further, addressing her target readers directly in simple words in her vocabulary. And that is all, and I thank you for your attention.